In terms of the topic today about what constitutes true wealth, I thought of a couple things. One was, I heard this just a couple days ago. It was, country western music. Now it's different than it used to be. In the old days, it was all about, your truck breaking down and your wife leaving home and you losing your job. And so one person said one time, what do you get when you play country music backwards? And said you get your truck back, you get your job back, you get your wife back. And so I found there's a lyric that reminded me of some of the old juxtaposition of things in country music titles. And this is by Dolly Parton. It said, "In the good old days when times were bad." Anybody hear that one? In the good old days when times were bad. We'd get, I have no idea how the rhythm to this goes, but we'd get up before sunup to get the work done up. We'd work in the fields till the sun had gone down. We've stood and we've cried as we have briskly watched a hailstorm beating our crops to the ground. We've gone to bed hungry many nights in the past, in the good old days when times were bad. No amount of money could buy from me the memories that I have of them. But then it also says, no amount of money could pay me to go back and live through it again. It's true that sometimes people will talk about the happiest times in their lives as being when they didn't have two nickels to rub together and they had to fight hard for everything. And because, you didn't expect success to come easy, when it came through diligence, hard work, and sacrifice, it was sweet. And then after a while, when people began to not have to perhaps work as hard for things, they almost felt as if something was missing in their life. Now, I'd be very happy to win the Mega Millions tomorrow, and then I could put myself to the test to just see, would this affect me? Would this affect me? Well, I've always thought that perhaps the most wonderful thing about having money is the power that it gives you. And I don't mean that people listen to you, although in Fiddler on the Roof, that's the thing, because he sings about, if I were a rich man, remember that? And he says that not only would, he says, when people come to me, they'd be begging me, asking my advice, because when you're rich, they think you really know. But he says, but the best thing, and he talks about how he'd build one big staircase just going up and one even longer coming down, and one more leading nowhere just to show. And he'd, fill his house with chicks and ducks and geese, and because, that's the sign of a rich person's house and his wealth. But he says the sweetest thing of all would be I'd have the time, to not have to work, to be able to go and spend my time in the temple, praying and studying. So there's a juxtaposition between what true wealth and true riches really are. Let me ask you this. If you had the choice between going blind and being rich, which one would you take? No contest, is it? No. And of course, Jesus in the gospel last week, I think it was, he talked about if your eye is an occasion of sin to you, or your hand or your feet, pluck it out, cut it off. He says, better to go into eternal life maimed than into hell as a complete person. And so the image is of really what is the most important and most lasting thing in life. I knew a man who, through hard work, but also through a real gift for management, and also he had a generous heart and a love for people. So what happened is he was a manager, he also was loved. And so what happened is, as a boss, people were happy to do not only what he asked, but also anything more that they could do, because they really felt appreciated by this person. They felt respected, and they felt that he was concerned for them as people and not just as workers. He had their back, and in that regard, they also, worked great. Because he was able to do that, he did very, very, very well. And by some very choice investments, like investing in Microsoft when it was, dollars a share, he wound up becoming well off, as they would say. And he was able to indulge himself in being a car enthusiast. And so at different times, he would have them for a while, drive them and everything. Well, I didn't tell you that the man, was seriously injured in a car accident once and almost died. The person that he married was the nurse that tended to him, for a very intense 6 months when they were both young. And what happened is he never really walked right again after that. But he loved fast cars. And he would occasionally have a Porsche, or a Shelby Cobra or a Ferrari. One poor day he was going somewhere, I guess it was the post office or whatever, and he had the Ferrari out, and a poor teenager who was dropping stuff off, backed into it with his truck, his employer's truck. I'm not sure how well that went down with the employer when he probably said, I hit a car today. Don't worry about it. It was, what kind of car was it? Ferrari. You hit a what? Please don't tell me you hit a Ferrari. But what happened is this. He told me one time in his life, because he was a generous man and he had a great faith, and it would come to us from time to time in our church and would say, Father, if you know anybody that needs anything, please let us know, because God's been very good to us, and we feel blessed. And so there was a time where there was a woman who needed a car to get to work, and she also needed that car to be able to visit her husband who had a stroke. And she would go to the nursing home every day to feed him. And then she also was the sole support for her family then at that point. I said, you asked me to ask you if there was anybody that needed anything. Could you help us by contributing to this, because we want to be able to get this person a car? He said, Father, I'll take care of it. And he bought the car for the person. Now, it wasn't a Ferrari or a Cobra, but it was a lifeline. And it made all the difference in the world for this woman, emotionally and financially. And he told me later on, he says, Father, I have to tell you, I bought some really wonderful cars in my day. In fact, one of the cars he had, he sold for $1 million. It was that valuable. Can you believe it? I knew I should have kept my '60 Chevy. And he said the greatest joy he ever got, though, amid all his cars, wasn't in the driving or wasn't in the selling. It was in the buying that car for that lady. He said, that gave me the best feeling of any of the cars I've ever had. The most enjoyment, the deepest pleasure. And I was so glad to be able to do it. That's true riches. And that's what it means when Jesus says to the man who has it all and is actually doing pretty good in life, he says, well, you want to come away and proclaim the kingdom? And he says, no, not really. Not if it costs me that. And then that's contrasted with the disciples who said, we left everything to follow you. But they're dumbfounded because in those days, like if I were a rich man, when you're rich, they think you really know. If you're rich back then, it means God is shining on you. If you're poor, it means you're afflicted. Somebody in your family did something wrong or you did. Look how miserable your life is. And so the rich were considered to be not only blessed, but to have God's approval and favor. And when Jesus says how hard it is for these people to enter the kingdom of heaven, the disciples, their jaw drops. And then they say, well, who can be saved? If the most favored among God's people, can't enter the kingdom of heaven, then what hope is there for us? And that's where Jesus talks about what's really riches in the sight of God. What are true riches in the sight of God? In the days when I was a youngster and we would always go to see Grandma and Grandpa Day on Sunday, and I was fortunate that my grandparents lived about 8 blocks from each other. It just happened that way. I could even ride my bike from my house because in those days the children never moved away very far. And in fact, generally speaking, since nobody really had anything when they got married, they lived in either the basement or in the upstairs room, for a year or two until they could save up a princely sum and get a house or an apartment before they could get a house. These were common experiences. And I remember when we would go to Grandma and Grandpa's house, as we were leaving, as all the cousins were leaving, we'd line up, and right by the door was Grandpa's easy chair, and there was a little table next to it. It had like an oriental tin that used to have mints in it from Ocean City. I still have that tin now in my office. Every now and then, they still make those mints. I put some in just to remind me. It still has the smell of mint in it. Now, I can't figure out how this happens because it's tin. It's not metal. I mean, it's not wood. But he would sit there, and he would have piled up in front of him, stacked on top of each other, either pennies or nickels or occasionally dimes. And he would hand them out to the grandchildren, all his cousins, as we were going out the door. And our parents would say, Pop, don't do that. What are you doing? And the point is, it gave him so much joy. It was like Midas dispensing gold, He was so happy to give it, and we were so happy to receive it because even a penny, you could get 2 for 1 penny candy in those days. And generally speaking, there wasn't always a whole lot of money to go around, so if you were walking down the road and you saw a penny on the ground, you bent over and picked it up. I still do that today. I can't stop myself from doing it. I don't know what I'm going to do with all of them one day as I put them in a jar. At one point I thought I could turn them in for copper, but now they're not even made out of copper anymore. But the point is, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and so is wealth. In that first reading in the scripture, it talks about, gold and silver, gold being accounted as sand and silver being accounted as mud in terms of the things that are really actually the things that are worthwhile in life. Today I had a funeral for a woman who lived to be 102. 102. She was one of 12 children. Can you imagine what it must have been like? She was born in 1916. So when she was 2, the First World War came around, and when she was a teenager, the Depression hit. What was life like then? But what happened is the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, the grandchildren came, they're all adults, they came to extol her in the service. And everyone had a hard time getting through their tribute to Grandma because they were crying so much. And really, when I listened to these people talking about how much Grandma influenced them, she was a farmer. Her husband was a blacksmith for the B&O Railroad. He died early in life. She had to be the wage earner. She went to one of the Baltimore factories that Baltimore was famous for in the days when, it really was a manufacturing city. And although they didn't have a lot, a lot of money, they had enough to keep body and soul together. And the soul was the most important thing. Because when these children spoke about what their grandma left her, there wasn't any concern at all about any monetary thing. Sometimes families break up over that stuff, when an estate has to be settled. And I've known people that are siblings that don't even talk to each other anymore because they were arguing about who was supposed to get what. And then the family that the parents worked so hard to keep together winds up being split asunder, all because of greed and want and desire. These young people talked about their grandma in a way that they said the things that she passed on to us was that her strength, her resilience, and her optimism. Now, I can't think of 3 better gifts to give somebody: strength, resilience, and optimism. So, in this reading about true wealth and true riches, wisdom is really, one of the greatest gifts you could have. But also one of the greatest gifts alongside of that is faith, which flows from wisdom, which lets us understand through the Spirit that there is one God. That's why Jesus, when he says, good teacher, Jesus says, why call me good? Only one is good. In other words, our thoughts should always be directed towards God, and not necessarily towards the people who catch our fancy, like Jesus, who was a famous itinerant preacher, but for who public opinion turned against while he was still a young man. So I don't know what your blessings are in life, or even what you count as blessings. I don't know what, your great desires might be. But the reality is shrouds don't have any pockets. We can't take anything with us except the love that we've given to others. And that alone is what will shine before the throne of God. That is the way it is with people, who grow rich in the sight of God and His kingdom, rather than growing rich for themselves. And if you had to have the choice between, having money, I started this by saying having $1 million or being blind. If you had to have the choice between being wealthy or entering the kingdom of heaven because of a good life, live generously and for others, which one would you pick?